Brutaxilos. Okay, so we got Brutaxilos here, and of course I'm Panera, and we're going to be answering some questions for Anatomy of Starcraft. So I guess go ahead and tell me your observations or questions.
So the first one, you were thinking of doing some critters, and I was looking at most of the critters are just normal animals, but one in particular was the lava crab from the campaign. If you guys don't remember, it was in the I think it was like one of the fire maps. I forgot what it was, and basically, um, it can sustain very high temperatures, I guess, and I think it glows red when it's like the lava's rising. So I was
Okay,
wondering what was
I got a picture of it here.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I was like wondering if there's any real animals that would actually like glow when there's like heat or something like that, and if that could actually help it in like managing its temperature and homeostasis and stuff.
Okay, well, the glowing is there's two ways that it could possibly be done. The most likely is bioluminescence, and it could be that the particular bacteria has a really high metabolic rate, similar to something you might see on like the hydrothermal vents,
Yep.
where it's expelling liquid like 400 plus degrees, and there's bacteria that are fixing sulfur right out of that fluid. Um, if they need a certain temperature to regulate their metabolism, in order to produce this bioluminescence. That's one possibility. Another, just looking at the picture here, it doesn't really have a whole lot going on. There's some armor plates, and then there's some what looks like soft, squishy parts that are the parts that glow. Um, yeah, there's no real precedent for that on anything on Earth. The other way it could maybe be done is perhaps it's fixing metals
Yeah.
uh, that have like really high temperature, something maybe like a tungsten. That, as you probably know, when you put your toast in the toaster, the little tungsten squiggly things light up and get really hot. It could be something similar to that, though I'm not sure how that would really impact it, other than perhaps making it more resistant to heat.
Maybe a camouflage.
Yeah, that's another option. It could be some sort of camouflage, which would lead us back to the bioluminescence.
Yep.
If it could control that, similar to like a lot of the deep sea creatures when they're communicating with each other, they can control various aspects of the bioluminescence. So that's probably what it is.
All right. So should I go second question now?
Second, yeah, go
All
ahead.
right. So this one's a more in detailed observation, and there's obviously some flaws to it too. But I think this it's a pretty detailed thing. So this is a take on Zerg creep and basically how Zerg reproduce, right? So the
Yep.
way I see it is creep is basically a hatchery's extension of its like circulatory system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a drone to build a structure on it, it's basically a form of it's kind of like the reproductive cycle of an anglerfish. So if you don't know what that is or anyone else, it's basically the male bites into the female and the males are smaller, right? They bite into the female, and they start to slowly like merge into it. It becomes like a lump on its side, and that way, the male can consistently produce sperm and produce like ensure that the female can continue to reproduce without looking for mate. So I was thinking like maybe the buildings itself can serve as a form of um, like sperm for the larva. I know larva. They say that it has all the DNA, but maybe the some whatever genetic gametes or something produced by the structures can help it like start the mutation for the eggs. And obviously there's some flaws to it, like what if there's two different bases? But I was thinking what you would think about that.
Well, the thing with looking at it that way, it's a very good idea. Basically, the logic behind it is that there's almost no resources in the deep sea, and so the male bites on, hijacks the circulatory system of the female, and that way she doesn't have to worry about any mate stuff, like you said. The issue that I would have with this hypothesis of yours is that if we're staying true as we can to lore, you're going to have the Zerg larva effectively, as was said, having the full genetic capabilities of all the Zerg strains. Now, my interpretation would be that perhaps there's some stimulus being provided by the buildings. So whether that's a certain hormonal cue, or in the case of, say, like raising queen bees, they have to be given actually like royal jelly, and which is really high nutrient. Mm-hmm. So perhaps some sort of different nutrient is provided to the larva. But I don't know if there's any in this genetic exchange in the strictest sense. Though I think that you're probably right on in that the creep does serve, however it's done, the creep is the transmitting, I guess, middleman, if you will. Yeah, I'm just kind of looking at pictures of creep and trying to figure it out myself here a little bit. Yeah, I think that that's probably the best thing would probably be some sort of pheromone or something like that. That way, any sort of hierarchy, such as like overlords and maybe the overmind or Kerrigan or whatever, can kind of keep tabs on various hatcheries. So if you don't want your hatcheries overrunning themselves and overrunning resources and whatnot, so in order to manage things better and manage the needs of the particular hive that you're talking about, it doesn't make a lot of sense to waste the resources on making hydrolisks if there's no particular need for them. Whereas it would make sense to, make a spawning pool, for example, and have the Zerglings out. So, you can make all the buildings you want, but you don't necessarily need them. And I think that's part of what being a Zerg is making things as cheap as possible for you at every angle. Mm-hmm. So yeah, no superfluous buildings for them. Yeah, I just don't know how they would transfer if you've got, let's say, a brand new hatchery on a planet.
Yeah.
And it's like the first sort of vanguard of the Zerg swarm. How would you get that extra genetic material into the larva in order to do that if you're in an isolated environment? I think it would make more sense to bring it with you and then just have various inhibitors and whatnot as you move along.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense to everybody, but okay. And actually, I think because we only have a few people interested, you can ask one more question or observation if you'd like, because you're a keener.
Well, I don't have any planned, but I guess I just thought of another one about creep. What do you think about Zergs consuming creep as a source of energy?
Yeah, that's something that I've struggled with in this series. You don't ever actively see the Zerg consuming creep. It's assumed that there is some sort of nutrient transfer. I believe it's said quite explicitly at some point, I think in the Starcraft 1 manual, I can't remember, that basically they do feed off of the creep somehow. So I would imagine that's possible. And then you get things like Aspire, which, it's basically a floating ball with tethers on it to keep it from flying away. Those tethers could have a sort of rudimentary xylem and phloem similar to what you'd see in a plant. Mm. Just some tissue in order to transport creep or whatever nutrients the creep provides up to roosting mutalisks and whatnot. So I think that there's some merit to it.
Yep.
It just depends on... obviously the overlords have a pretty intimate relationship with the creep because they can produce it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the overseers can produce changelings, which may or may not be made of creep. So, yeah, it makes sense. What doesn't make sense is that the Zerg all seem to have different feeding methods. So I'd assume that if you're a pack of Zerglings out in the middle of a desert doing your scouting thing and you're pretty far from creep and you run across some sort of critter. I would imagine that that's something they could actively feed on. I don't think that it's a limiting factor as far as their nutrient intake, but it could explain why they're able to move faster on creep in that their metabolism might kick up a notch with all the extra influx of nutrients. Mm-hmm. Whether that's just absorbing somehow through their skin or whatever, I don't know. It's kind of one of those ambiguous things like Protoss, how they eat. Photosynthetic, chemosynthetic, you take your pick, throw a dart at a spinning wheel, and you're pretty much going to be right on. So, okay, well, I think I got another person here that wants to do this, actually.
All right.
But anyway, yeah, if you have any more questions or whatever, just leave them in the thread, and I'll be sure to get to them. And feel free to make contributions on your own.
All right, no problem.
Okay, bye.
See ya.
Hey, you got another question.
Yeah, I don't know if this is really in your, like, level, but, so if you look at the Xel'Naga, they're planning to, like, merge the Protoss and Zerg together, like, slowly and naturally. Yep. Is there any process that would actually have that, like, two species merge together as one, like, just by living together for long periods of time?
Well, the Zerg do a pretty good job of it. As far as, like, each new strain is a former different species. There is one example that comes to mind. There's a type of virus, I believe it's an influenza, that basically got into songbird genetics. So the way a virus works, obviously, is that many viruses is they inject their DNA into a cell and then hijack the cell to make more viruses. Well, this virus, which is now apparently extinct, its entire genome is now inside the genome of the bird. So every time the bird reproduces, it's reproducing however many cells it has worth of this genetic material. So it's basically an all-in sort of strategy for the virus, because if this species of bird goes extinct, obviously the virus goes extinct, but the trade-off is that it doesn't have to do anything in order to reproduce and whatnot. So that would be one example of what you're thinking of. There are other examples, like salamander complexes, they're called, especially in the Appalachian regions, as well as in China. There's a fair bit where there's a discrete species name, but as far as telling them apart, they go to like species A, species B, species D, C, whatever, and they can all interbreed, although sometimes, maybe A can't breed with D, but can breed with B, which can breed with D, or whatever. Like the genes manage to pass along. Another really interesting case is in the genus Xanthusia, which is, I believe the common name is night lizards, or fence lizards, or something like that. Anyway, in the southern states, I believe they're from, where two species hybridized. So that's basically the gist of what you're asking is hybridizing the two possible. So two species of lizard hybridized, and then that hybridized with the third one. And as a result, you only have females in the species, but one female has to mount the other female, and then the one that's acting as the female gets gravid or pregnant. I can't remember if you're in live birth.
I know that.
So yeah, there are some really interesting cases, but by and large, they're almost all closely related. The one that is probably most relevant is the virus and bird. Given the nature of the Zerg and the fact that they did start off as a parasite, and they have been able to incorporate so many things with this larval strategy, presumably bringing Protoss DNA into the Zerg is the proper way of doing it. And there's already some examples, like Queens apparently have some Protoss DNA, and I guess hybrids too, but I don't know. I think the hybrids are made typically in Zerg hives, as far as I know. I don't really know, but anyway, so there is the potential for that. And again, with the Zerg, it doesn't matter if their hybrid is viable or not. So by viability, I mean the ability to reproduce on its own, because they're just replicating that strain over and over to make non-reproductives anyway. So it is probably more likely that it's possible than something you'd see here on Earth, where things typically need to reproduce themselves.
Okay. What about what is it called, the endocellular theory or something, where the mitochondria and chloroplasts were like originally other what's it called, like prokaryotes or something?
Yeah, they were. These organelles were either complex proteins or perhaps vestiges from another organism that have been hijacked and repurposed by the cell, sort of like you could imagine the Borg Collective from Star Trek, something similar to that, where they're just taking the, I guess, biological technology, quote unquote, and repurposing it. So yeah, that's a really good example. The best examples seem to be on the microbiology level. But again, the Zerg aren't making reproductives. You can think of them sort of like an ant colony, where it makes more sense for the individuals to be altruistic and kill themselves in the line of duty than to try to reproduce themselves, because they're more closely related to their sisters in any given strain. So an Ultralisk is more related to other Ultralisks than it would be to its own children. So it makes sense genetically to go about it that way, and that's just something that's very sort of an advanced genetics of ants, which is mind melting, and I won't get into it.
All right, I guess that's it then. Thanks.
All right, if you get any more questions.